Hello, I am Raymond Shadow. Imagine the curtain rises, and the first thing we see is a grand celebration taking place on the streets of Rome. Large crowds have taken to the streets to cheer and celebrate the triumph of Julius Caesar and his army. At this moment, the internal situation in Roman society is quite chaotic. In the decades prior to this, Rome had experienced several civil wars. Tyrants rose to power, only to be overthrown by other tyrants. There was constant internal struggle regarding the direction the country should take. But at this current moment, Rome is a republic, at least for now. For Rome, the core significance of the republic lies in the fact that no single person can control everything. Power is dispersed among multiple different positions and committees. Citizens of the republic are supposed to stand up and debate what they believe is best for the city. In other words, although citizens might have fundamental disagreements, in a republic, what matters is that they always share a consensus, that they wish to find a way to cooperate. However, as Caesar returns with his army and people celebrate in the streets, the drama begins with two elected officials watching this party. They comment on how dangerous all of this seems for the health of the republic. They say, "Look at how fickle and easily influenced this crowd is. Look at how they celebrate this guy, chanting his name. Honestly, this doesn't look like the behavior of citizens of a republic at all. This is starting to look like the typical mob behavior found in monarchies or tyrannies. Look at certain countries in Northeast Asia today. Does it look familiar? By the way, this war that Caesar just finished fighting wasn't to resist an external enemy wanting to harm the Roman people. No, Caesar simply defeated a fellow Roman. That man was Pompey, along with his sons. These were Caesar's fellow Romans, rival generals who possessed their own armies. The point is, these two officials look at this crowd and ask, what kind of crowd would celebrate the defeat of their own compatriot like this? This no longer looks like the people of a republic. It is clear that people are betting their destiny on this man who is about to take power. If you want to be on the right side, you have to join Caesar's camp now, go to the streets, and cheer for this man. That is what you must do. The two officials talking about this terrible sight begin to tear down the images of Caesar plastered all over the city walls. They believe all of this is dangerously inciting the people's emotions and could lead to Caesar being crowned king of Rome. In fact, as Caesar parades into the city, then enters the public square with his entourage, and steps onto the podium in front of the crowd gathered there to pay him tribute, someone offers him a crown. They try to put the crown on his head to make him the king of Rome, but he refuses. The crowd goes wild. During this ceremony, the crown is offered to him 2 more times, and he refuses it both times. People feel, look, he doesn't even want to be king. This is even more reason to love him and try to make him king. While Caesar is on stage, the crowd quiets down for a moment, and a mysterious man shouts to Caesar from the back of the crowd. He says, "Caesar, beware the Ides of March." The Ides of March is the midpoint of March. For them, it is just a few days away. Surrounded by the crowd, Caesar hears this guy telling him to be careful, and he just laughs it off. The whole audience laughs. Everyone is happy. But the scene shifts, and we see 2 men from Caesar's entourage having a conversation after this ceremony. These 2 men will become the protagonists of the story Shakespeare wants to tell. Their names are Cassius and Brutus. Simply put, their reactions to this series of events regarding Caesar are completely different. As the crowd begins to support Caesar, Cassius looks at Brutus, who is pacing back and forth, obviously deep in thought. Cassius says, "I can see you are a bit anxious about all this, Brutus." Brutus replies, "Yes, I'm indeed anxious. Look at what is happening. We are all senators and have a responsibility to protect the Roman Republic. And this man named Caesar, I have no personal grudge against him. He certainly hasn't done anything to me, and he hasn't seized the crown yet. But even so, the atmosphere clearly visible from the crowd really makes me feel that we are about to lose the Republic. What should we do?" In the play, Brutus's character represents the philosophical stance of Stoicism, which is intentionally arranged by Shakespeare. In the play, he is married to the daughter of Cato the Younger, a famous Stoic. He represents the kind of stoicism that Cicero talked about, which emphasizes service to the state rather than just individual moral development. In short, Brutus is in a typical Stoic moment, feeling conflicted between his rational moral obligation to Rome and its ideals, and his personal loyalty to Caesar as a person, perhaps even viewing him as a friend. On the other hand, Cassius' inner monologue is completely different. He is a long-time political rival of Julius Caesar. He has said some things about Caesar in public that were quite mean. Furthermore, the last thing he wants to see in this world is Julius Caesar possessing monarch-level political control. So, for very personal reasons, Cassius has a plan. He wants to kill Caesar before he takes power. But he knows that if he just does it, even with the help of a few other lower-level senators, he knows that in the court of public opinion, it will make him look like a bloodthirsty assassin, or make him look like he just wants to be king himself. He can't just stand up and do it. Therefore, his plan turns to recruiting Brutus to join the assassination conspiracy, because he knows that Brutus is seen by the people as a highly moral Stoic senator who loves Rome. People believe that he would never do anything unless it was for the benefit of Rome. He knows that Brutus's involvement will make things look much better for him. So he begins to flatter Brutus in their conversation. He tells Brutus he is amazing. He reminds Brutus that it was his ancestor who overthrew Rome's first king because that king violated Roman principles. He starts to question Brutus's honor, which really touches Brutus. Like, what? You are struggling over your personal loyalty to Caesar? What about your sense of honor for Rome and the public good? Are you not an honorable man? Brutus says, listen, I see your point. And I am honorable. I mean, old Brutus is still in here, guys. It's just that I'm not sure if killing Caesar is best for Rome. If I had that certainty, then without a doubt, I would do what is necessary for honor. Hearing Brutus say this, Cassius has a bunch of letters forged addressed to Brutus, pretending to be written by the Roman citizens he represents, calling on him to eliminate Caesar to save Rome. It is this false picture of the world created by Cassius that convinces Brutus he needs to join this conspiracy in the name of saving the Republic. The plot continues to develop, and several other senators also join the conspiracy. One of them even flatters and persuades Caesar to come to the government building on the Ides of March. On that day, as the conspirators escort Caesar into the government building, and they gather around to discuss policy, one of the conspirators asks Caesar to pardon his brother, who had previously been banished from the city. Caesar refuses. Just as he is distracted, one of the assassins, Casca, draws his knife, says, "Speak, hands, for me," and stabs Julius Caesar, signaling all the other conspirators to act. Then each of them steps forward in turn, stabbing him again and again. The last one to stab is Brutus. As Brutus stabs him, Caesar looks up at him and utters that famous line, "Even you, Brutus." Then Caesar falls, completely lifeless, collapsing on the floor. The conspirators surround him. For them, the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar seems to be successful up to this moment. Out of respect for everyone's time, let's jump straight into this story and see how Shakespeare adapted the real-world assassination of Julius Caesar into a play or tragedy. It should be noted that there are certainly many historical inaccuracies in this play. However, Shakespeare incorporated a large number of real figures and events from the time of Caesar's murder, which is truly impressive. Shakespeare mainly drew from the historian Plutarch's description of the events that took place in Rome at that time. In any case, these characters are crucial for understanding his intent. First of all, in this story, Shakespeare wants to convey several different messages. Many of them are to emphasize the ambiguity of how such events develop. Remember, this is a tragedy in the ancient Greek sense. So it's not like a modern movie with good guys and bad guys. Part of the work tragedy asks the audience to do is to think about this situation without idealizing or demonizing things. That being said, a more critical message he intends to convey, which is very important here, is that he wants to show how naive political violence like this is regarding the operation of political reality. This approach almost never achieves the goal expected by the perpetrator. To put it slightly differently, the entire premise of conducting political violence in a republic is quite outrageous. Look back at history and count how many times in a republic someone thought someone was a political problem, so they assassinated them, and then the whole world just moved on. Oh, that guy is dead. What shall we do? No, the real world never happens like that. Political violence almost always further enrages and strengthens those who originally supported that person. Violence often turns that person into a symbol representing a cause greater than that single individual. So, in reality, violence often strengthens the cause they oppose. Shakespeare is saying here that, purely strategically speaking, conducting political violence in a republic like this is quite foolish. Political violence is also full of hypocrisy, at least in the way the conspirators in the play do it. The argument here reminds me of the way Albert Camus argued against the death penalty in his famous essay Reflections on the Guillotine. Part of his point is, if someone has done something terrible and violent to an innocent person, violating their life in an unforgivable way, if your knee-jerk reaction to this is that, for the sanctity of life, we need to kill this person and take their life, and anyone who disagrees with this is just secretly siding with the murderer, Camus would say, this is not only one of the most obvious examples of hypocrisy you can find. But most people who talk like this have no idea to what extent the things they support are eroding the ideals they claim to care so much about. Living in a society that so easily and blatantly violates the sanctity of life is part of the reason why life becomes no longer sacred to people. Similarly, for Brutus and Cassius to claim that in order to protect the Republic and everything it represents, I need to kill this guy I think is dangerous. This is the definition of hypocrisy. To step out of the path of resolving political differences through peaceful means for the sake of the so-called sanctity of maintaining a peaceful political structure. This is simply blatant hypocrisy. Another thing Shakespeare wants to point out is that even if Brutus and Cassius say they killed this guy to maintain the sanctity of the Republic, which Republic are they maintaining exactly? They look back at history and have a nostalgic memory of some idealized Republic, where apparently everyone worked together, chocolate syrup flowed in the rivers, and it went on forever. But did that ever really exist? The point is, usually when people commit such political violence, they do so to stop the world from becoming something that in many ways it already is, and always has been. Rome at this time had already experienced decades of civil war and internal conflict. Looking at the problems in front of you, recalling a distant moment in the past that seemed to have no problems, and then trying to make the world fit your nostalgic fantasy, this is always easy. You can do this with your childhood. You can do this with relationships. In this sense, Brutus and Cassius killed a man to save a Rome that never truly existed. Again, part of the work Shakespeare is trying to do in this play is to get the audience to think about the complexity that led to this political assassination. He brilliantly demonstrates another angle. If a person considers themselves to be very honorable, honor, this is actually a virtue that makes them easily manipulated when facing bad people. Of course, Brutus is the character he uses to show this, while Cassius is the one manipulating him. Interestingly, if you ask 100 people what the 5 most important virtues are, it is not shocking that many include honor. But this is precisely the brilliance of Shakespeare in this play. What does it really mean to have honor? Try to give a definition yourself. Over the years, not many philosophers have conducted a truly in-depth study of honor and all its implications. It turns out that honor is a surprisingly open-ended virtue. First, because honor always implies that you adhere to a certain code. And because that code is not necessarily fixed to anything real, different people can consider themselves honorable, which manifests in the real world as extremely different behaviors being called honorable. One person might say, "You never betray a friend." Okay, that's a matter of honor. But another person might say, if your friend is going to drive drunk, you tell the bartender they are drunk and let them take the keys. Because true honor is taking care of your friend when they are going to harm themselves. See, when you consider that the code someone reveres always comes from others, when you consider that your honor usually lies in your public reputation, this actually externalizes the moral process, detaching people from internal deliberation about what is the right thing to do, and turning their decision-making into something very simple. When loyalty to a pre-established code and honor replace those who truly stand up and try to weigh the moral complexity of major decisions, Shakespeare's point is that this can be catastrophic in a republic. Especially when it allows people to avoid having a deeper conversation with themselves to think about why they are doing this. Think about it. A person can do something and say it is for the good of humanity. Just like Brutus says he is saving the Republic. But if someone can always hide behind this honor and say, I did all this for the greater good, then this person can also ignore many of the twisted reasons driving them to do these things, and can avoid considering the negative impact of what they have done. Later, they only refer to the bodies on the street as unintended consequences.
Friedrich Nietzsche
talked about this. By the way, Nietzsche thought this play was the best thing Shakespeare ever wrote. He said along the same lines that when people simply conform their behavior to an ideal or live by a code of honor, a real danger is that when they give up the work of truly considering all internal drives and all external factors in decisions that affect others, they become easier to manipulate by anyone persuasive enough, as long as that person can convince them that it is required by their code. When Brutus does not consider how the rhetoric used by Cassius has changed the interpretation of the code he is already committed to, he becomes an easier tool for Cassius' fanaticism. This is one of the most important points Shakespeare targets in this play. Let's introduce more events from the story to further elaborate on this idea. Because after Caesar was murdered in that government hall, all the conspirators holding knives, immediately after that moment happened, chaos broke out around them. People started screaming and running away. Some conspirators themselves began to scream, "Tyranny is dead. The Republic is saved. Cheer for us and everything we have done." Brutus at this time even thinks that it is a good idea for all of them to bathe in Caesar's blood up to their elbows. I'm serious. His idea is, look, hundreds of years later, when history is written, us bathing in the tyrant's blood like this will definitely be one of the powerful visuals people will like. This is again some kind of nostalgia for a world that never existed. After their collective bathing ritual, as part of the conspirators' plan, in order to get Caesar to a place where he could be assassinated, they made sure beforehand to separate Caesar from his close friend, who was also the most likely person to intervene, a man named Mark Antony. Mark Antony heard what happened to Caesar. He sent a messenger to tell the conspirators that he was calm and didn't want to hurt any of them. He just wanted to go back and collect Caesar's body, and maybe ask them some questions about why Julius Caesar had to be murdered instead of choosing any other options. When he arrived there, Brutus explained his side of the story, saying he wanted to save the Republic. After listening to his story, Mark Antony had an idea. He shook hands with Brutus, and also shook the bloody hands of all the conspirators. He said, "All right guys, I'm done here. But I have a request, if possible. I really want to take Caesar's body to the public square, stand in front of everyone and give a speech, sort of delivering a eulogy for this guy. You see, I just want to give the Roman people some clear explanation about everything that happened today." Brutus said, "That's a good idea. I like that plan. But listen, Mark Antony, the point of all this is to preserve the Republic and maintain stability. If you do this, you can't go out there and just start attacking me and all the other conspirators in front of the crowd. And to be safer, I, Brutus, will go out before you. I will give a speech and speak to the crowd personally." What happens next is simply a masterpiece of rhetoric. Shakespeare wrote down the arguments of Brutus and Mark Antony to the crowd. Brutus goes up first. His speech begins with Romans, countrymen, and lovers. Hear me for my cause. Then he delivers a rational, clear, clever speech, explaining why Caesar had to die. He says, "Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more." Brutus talks about Julius Caesar's crazy ambition and how it was incompatible with the experiment Rome was trying to conduct. By the time he finished speaking, that fickle crowd that cheered for Caesar in the streets at the beginning of the play, the crowd that would have made Caesar king earlier the same day if he had agreed, had now been persuaded by the power of reason that Brutus and the conspirators were the side Rome needed. Thunderous applause. "Good job, Brutus. What a good man. Maybe we should make him Caesar," one of them said. Then Mark Antony gave his speech. He begins with one of the most famous lines in classical literature, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." Look, just in that first sentence, he places himself in a very humble position, setting a tone that allows him to deal a fatal blow to all the conspirators. Because when Mark Antony speaks, he does not prioritize providing rational arguments to the crowd. Mark Antony appeals to their emotions. He delivers a speech that makes them feel fear, jealousy, and disgust towards their own compatriots. He constantly refers to all the conspirators as honorable men. The more he speaks, and then goes back to talk a bit about what they did to Caesar, and then returns to the word honorable, the crowd begins to realize this is sarcasm. The same group of people, fans of Caesar earlier, fans of Brutus 10 minutes ago, were driven into a frenzy by Mark Antony's rhetorical skills. So much so that Brutus, Cassius, and all the other conspirators had to flee Rome just to continue fighting for their lives. The importance of rhetoric, especially in a republic, is one of the biggest points Shakespeare wants to show here. You know, considering that in a monarchy, if you are just an ordinary person living your life, and you happen to be very good at rhetoric and persuasion, this might not translate into much political power in that society at all. More likely, it will get you into trouble at some point. The only time you might use this skill is probably when you speak very, very persuasively to a parking enforcement officer trying to give you a ticket. That's probably all it does for you. But one of Shakespeare's points here is that when a society becomes a republic, again, the focus now is on people educating themselves and debating what they think is best for society. Suddenly, in that world, people who are really good at rhetoric may become some of the most politically powerful people in the entire country. They know how to phrase things in a way that truly resonates with people. They know how to exploit people's emotions. They know how to speak to different groups of people and selectively exclude certain parts of what is happening to make this picture of reality look like obvious truth. As we know, great rhetoricians like this are usually hired by people who already hold political power. Because those in power usually know how important it is to have such a person framing things in a way most beneficial to them. The key is, in a republic, this is actually where the battle for political power is won or lost. It is on the level of rhetoric. When Mark Antony says friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, that lend me your ears part is highly symbolic for Shakespeare, symbolizing how people seize political power in a republican system. More importantly, whoever wins or loses here doesn't even necessarily need to represent the true full picture of what is happening in the world. Facts begin to become less important in a republic than the impact of the narrative on the crowd. Remember Cassius forging fake letters caring about citizens, calling on Brutus to save the republic? Does this remind you of anything happening today? Remember, it was those fake letters that shook Brutus, moved him out of a place of moral deliberation, and then made him go all out to kill Julius Caesar. In a republic, all it takes to make an otherwise serious person give up their moral responsibility is a fragment of information about what is happening in the world, followed by rhetoric persuasive enough to convince them that this is the whole truth. Do not understand this as Shakespeare saying we shouldn't have a republic. It is more of his call for people to understand that we have a responsibility to ask the right questions of those who provide us with information about the world. Considering that neither Mark Antony nor Brutus are straightforward people in these speeches, naively trying to deliver impartial truth to the people. In a republic, especially in the post-truth era media we live in, we need to understand that this applies to everyone from whom we get information. Political power is always hanging in the balance, and we cannot be too naive to think that the biggest problem we face as listeners is just finding out what the truth is from all the different sources. No, the deeper concern here is for us to become students of rhetoric, studying how rhetoric manufactures what we collectively consider to be truth at any given moment. In fact, scholars often think that the entire tragedy of Julius Caesar is Shakespeare showing the 4 different types of rhetoric he saw mesmerizing people. Depending on which rhetoric resonates with you personally, this will usually determine who you listen to. Brutus sees rhetoric as the skill of constructing a rational narrative about the world. Mark Antony uses rhetoric as a weapon or tool of power. Cassius uses rhetoric in a private, almost Machiavellian way. For him, the end always justifies the means. And Caesar uses rhetoric to command people's actions in the most effective way. Look, Brutus made a big mistake. He walked into the square and delivered a completely rational speech to that crowd. That crowd wasn't made of people who loved reason and the republic like Brutus did. The people at that time were angry. When their emotions were already ignited in Rome's crazy situation at the time, appealing to these emotions became a more powerful form of rhetoric, regardless of the truth. So, in this world of political power gains and losses, what actually happens is largely determined by the quality of the audience, determining who can ascend to the pinnacle of power through narrative, and who can maintain power by controlling the narrative. Shakespeare seems to want us to understand that only we as listeners have the ability to verify. If this world consists mainly of those who are unaware that this is the end game, if most people really think that what they are doing is just finding out the truth, rather than studying how the truth is constructed through rhetoric, then for Shakespeare, they are just as susceptible to the influence of rhetoric as Brutus, who was manipulated by Cassius in private, and then destroyed by Mark Antony in public. After Mark Antony gave his speech and the conspirators had to flee Rome, the remaining plot is quite brutal for Cassius and Brutus. Immediately after the assassination, civil war broke out in Rome. This is far from the outcome they planned when they decided with infinite wisdom that this was the right move. While in exile, the two had a fierce argument. They almost completely broke up. But eventually, they reconciled. Shortly after this, Brutus's wife committed suicide by swallowing hot coals. It hurts. I mean, after this, despite trying to maintain his public image as a stoic leader, Brutus also struggled to hold up. But in the end, regardless of exile, the world caught up with both of them. Both had to fight on the battlefield of this civil war triggered by their actions. Cassius asked his friend to kill him in a battle because he thought he was about to lose the battle and be captured. The result was very tragic. He misread the situation. But he died after making his choice. Cassius went just like that. On the other hand, Brutus won the first battle against Mark Antony and others. But in the subsequent battle, he was finally defeated, and then committed suicide, rather than facing being paraded through the streets of Rome and all the consequences that followed. At the end of the play, Mark Antony delivers a speech, speaking kindly of Brutus. His famous line calls Brutus the noblest Roman of them all. He says this was a man different from all other conspirators. He joined the assassination plot not out of jealousy of Caesar, but out of honest consideration for the public good of Rome. The play then ends, strongly implying that with the end of all these civil war battles, Octavius, Caesar's nephew, will rule Rome as a monarch, and the Republic is now finally coming to an end. Since we have reached the end, there are some important things to consider about this play. For hundreds of years, scholars have almost unanimously agreed that the main tragic hero of this play is not Julius Caesar, but Brutus. So if you watch this play or read it, be sure to pay special attention to him and his personal transformation. He is an interesting kind of tragic hero, because in many tragedies, you usually see characters heading towards decline because of their own pride, desire, or hubris, etc. But for Brutus, his decline actually has to do with him simply overestimating how much good he could do. As for all the death and self-harm at the end of the play, this is sometimes considered Shakespeare giving Brutus the stoic death he truly deserved. As many may know, part of Stoic ethics says that if circumstances make it impossible to continue living rationally, then ending one's own life can be a rational choice. To be clear, for them, this is a very extreme situation, and they do not take this lightly. That being said, a very interesting line of thought I see on this comes from a professor named Patrick Gray. He raises a point about Brutus, this tension we see in him from the very beginning of the play, this war deep in his heart, between loyalty to Caesar's humanity and his honorable obligation to Rome itself. Patrick Gray believes this might be Shakespeare using Brutus as a stage to enact a tension between a disciplined Stoic moral approach and a prototypical Christian moral approach that values pity and human dignity more. When these two things coexist within one person, if someone tries to live by both at the same time, it often creates tension. This is what Shakespeare really wants to express. In Gray's reading, Brutus ending his life at the end of the play is not a sign that Shakespeare implies Stoicism ultimately won inside Brutus. For him, this is the tragic end of a man who never truly became the ruthless Stoic sage he wanted to be, and also the tragic end of a man who never found a way to make peace with a compassion that constantly undermined the Stoic ideal he tried to follow. Romeo and Juliet, by William Shakespeare. Many of you may have been forced to read this book in high school. Back then, we had no idea how much philosophy was embedded behind the events of this play. This is a play where I think to understand the meaning of many things in it, you first have to know the story of the scene that happens at the end. First, once you know the ending of this play, everything before starts to take on a whole new meaning. Second, I am referring to the scene in a church graveyard where 3 people lie dead in a tomb. Third, 2 of them are teenagers who have just committed suicide. Their names are Romeo and Juliet. The other person is Count Paris, who was stabbed to death by Romeo just hours ago. Outside the tomb, a local church friar named Lawrence is pleading with the city authorities. He admits that everything happening here is partly his fault, as he helped Romeo and Juliet plan the things that led them to this situation. Meanwhile, the fathers of both Romeo and Juliet stand near the tomb, mourning their lost children. They look at each other, as two people who have hated each other for a long time, and they say, "You know what? Enough. Let's shake hands now and call a truce between us. Look at what the feud between our families has led to. We are about to lose two children." The reason this play is special, unlike Shakespeare's other works, is that we can actually reasonably guess what he wanted to focus on. The beauty of this play is that Shakespeare did not write the original story of Romeo and Juliet. No, he rewrote the story. He initially saw this as a poem written by someone else 30 years earlier. Even that poem borrowed heavily from previous legends. By the way, this kind of restructuring stories, adding new things, making it your own, was standard industry practice in the 1590s when Shakespeare was writing. Anyway, this means scholars can uniquely consider the original source from which Shakespeare constructed the story, and then we can know his thoughts because we can look at what he chose to add to his version of the story. The content he added becomes a statement about what he thought was important to include in his version. From the beginning, in a story usually remembered as one of the most beautiful love stories ever, when Shakespeare includes violence as a central theme as well, this play will have multiple layers of meaning. He will give violence the treatment it receives in tragedy, where we try to consider it with complexity, appropriate ambiguity, and we try not to succumb to the temptation of demonizing violence or idealizing it. The first act of the play opens with a street brawl between two families in Verona, Italy. On one side is the Montague family, on the other is the Capulet family. The feud between these two families in this town has been going on for generations. Grandpa Capulet couldn't stand Grandpa Montague. Their children hate each other. Even their dogs hate each other. There must have been a lot of barking in this neighborhood before. So Act 1 begins with the servants of these families clashing in the street, and then once they start fighting, it escalates to other members of the family joining in. There's Tybalt, a Capulet, kind of the big brother figure of that family, someone you really don't want to mess with. He jumps in and fights with Benvolio, one of the older boys on the Montague side. The townspeople stand helplessly on the sidelines watching people go from verbal arguments to loud noises, and then to drawing swords against each other. The feud between these two families once again makes living in this neighborhood an extremely terrifying thing for everyone. Who wants to walk out of the house and watch someone get stabbed to death in their front yard? This fight is interrupted by the local peacekeeping militia. These people had to intervene in the fight because the real authorities took a long time to arrive. Prince Aeschylus, the person in charge of the town, stands before everyone. He looks at everyone who was fighting just now and says, "Listen, I am tired of you Capulets and Montagues making this town uninhabitable. So from now on, I'm going to make it clear. If any of your families fight like this again, the next time will be punishable by death. In other words, if you fight, I will kill you. If you want to know if I'm joking, just try it." The two families cool down and return to their respective houses. The crowd disperses. But importantly, the prince did not bring true peace, nor did it feel like anything that just happened was resolved. The violence in Act 1 foreshadows a series of increasingly intense violent scenes that will occur in this play. Later, Tybalt will challenge Romeo to a duel because he disrespected his family's honor. Tybalt kills Romeo's friend in another incident. Then Romeo comes back and kills Tybalt as revenge. After that, Romeo will kill Count Paris. Another person dies. The point is, this level of violence was not in the original story. So, scholars over the centuries have proposed that Shakespeare wanted to show something important about this kind of violence here. The first thing to say might be that he wants us to realize that violent feuds between families or groups like this, the kind of thing that makes a place terrible, usually happen when some external authority is not doing its job properly. In our modern world, this might be that the authorities are corrupt in some way. It might be that they are not properly trained or underfunded. Maybe the authorities turn a blind eye to what is happening for various reasons. Remember, the prince didn't appear in the play until it was too late. Even when he appeared, he didn't really issue that kind of deterrent punishment. So Shakespeare's initial point is that in the absence of true authority or moral leadership to help mediate these things, ordinary people, usually men, will display this behavior. They will establish codes of honor that people need to follow, and then they will use violence as a way to solve each other's problems. By the way, this was also very common in Shakespeare's time. Maybe you've heard of people back then, if they had a problem with someone, they would challenge them to a duel. Two people drawing weapons in the name of their own honor, engaging in a life-and-death struggle. That's what you would do. You could find all sorts of guides from that time. Gentleman's Quarterly would write down the rules for when you duel with people, how and when to proceed if you want to remain civilized. This is similar to the way men sometimes still behave today. But whether then or today, this dueling culture is said by men to have a built-in purpose. They would say it helps maintain order. If someone disrespects you, you fight that person. The silver lining to this is that if people get punched in the face or killed as a consequence for disrespecting others, then they won't go around disrespecting people. In other words, this is a so-called code formed between people in the absence of real authority to make the world safer. But Shakespeare tries to show in this play that this is complete nonsense in a way. Actually, this is not how these honor codes work at all. Jill Levinson wrote a great article where she puts forward a claim about the violence we see throughout the play. The idea is that Shakespeare understood how backward these honor codes are. First, think about the absolute genius logic embedded here. Someone disrespects your honor, so now you have to go beat them up. But now whoever got beaten up, their honor has also been disrespected, and now they have to go beat someone else to correct this situation. You'll meet this kind of idiot guy saying, well, real men don't do that. Real men fight, and then win or lose, they dust each other off, shake hands, and actually become friends afterwards. Okay, I'm not saying that never happens. But what happens more often in the world we live in? Someone gets beaten up, they come back with a group of friends or a gun. The whole logic of this setup is stupid. Levinson points out that Shakespeare tries to show here that these honor codes not only actually fail to maintain social order, but violence like this even has a cumulative factor, making it something that actively destroys order. When you solve problems like this, what you are left with is a world like the one we see in the play, where even the servants of the Capulets and Montagues fight as soon as they meet. Duels are initiated. People kill each other to avenge other killings. This is the world produced by this strategy. So, if what is happening here is not their fantasy of maintaining world order, Shakespeare makes us think about who exactly all this violence serves. Well, if you pay attention, it mostly just serves the pride and ego of those who are fighting. It makes the Montague or Capulet people feel good about themselves. Only when their pride is secured do they hide behind this story about how it is beneficial to others. For William Shakespeare, this is a very dangerous trap that people easily fall into. Because whenever a society has a problem that needs to be solved, violence can usually be a very simple solution that doesn't require that much creativity. Then on an abstract level, violence becomes something easy to add to the culture. But once it is there, embedded in the way people solve problems, removing it is always much harder than adding it. This reminds me of the points people sometimes make about protecting freedom. It is very easy to give up the freedom you have to solve some temporary security problems. But once you give up those freedoms, it is much harder to get them back. Violence becomes something similar here. When you read or watch this play and see all the violence Shakespeare incorporated into it, understand that he wants us to think about a bigger question. This is a point originally raised by the philosopher Elizabeth Fraser from Oxford University. She said a real question Shakespeare wants us to think about is, if any, exactly what kind of authority can truly end the ongoing violence between these two groups. She believes what he shows us is that it is not the police who can stop such fighting, nor is it the more general state authority. After all, the prince in the play always appears too late, and then doesn't actually execute any punishment, especially involving members of these elite families, who seem to always get away with it. Nor is it the moral leadership of the church that can stop this fighting. Everything they use to try to bring the families together also fails miserably. So what other authority can we rely on? Well, for Shakespeare, maybe you would think these people just need to go the Gandhi route. Look, All these people really need to unite is the authority of love in their lives. Love is ultimately the antidote to all violence in the world. Well, as he shows in the play, even the intense love of Romeo and Juliet that we will talk about later is far from enough to truly unite these families. The only thing that finally ends the violence between these two groups is a catastrophe. It is the event of Romeo and Juliet committing suicide that shakes these families to the core. As bleak as this paints the world, for Shakespeare, to get any semblance of peace between these groups who are otherwise so obsessed with their own pride, it seems the only way is for some kind of disaster to happen, allowing us to at least temporarily get a respite from the violence that would have continued. The point is, although this play is mainly seen by people as a love story, this point about violence may be one of the main messages Shakespeare wanted to convey to people through this play. However, the story is also about love on a very important level. So let's return to the events in the play so we can talk more about it. After the prince threatened the families with death, after the fight ended and everyone went on with their lives, a relative of the prince, Count Paris, pulled Lord Capulet, the father of one of the families, aside and asked if they could talk privately. He said, "Lord Capulet, you have a daughter, right? Her name is Juliet. As far as I know, well, today is your lucky day. I, as a member of the royal family that runs this city, have a proposal. I want to marry your daughter, make her my wife, and merge your family into this more royal family I belong to. What do you think about this?" To this, Mr. Capulet said, but she hasn't turned 14 yet." Count Paris quoted, "Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride." In other words, Count Paris said every second now is not a good idea. Juliet is only 13 after all. If we can wait 2 years to talk about this, he personally would be more willing. 2 years later she will be 15, completely ready for marriage then. At the same time, look, we have a grand party tonight. Everyone will be there. If this is really what you want to do, you can come over tonight, introduce yourself to Juliet, and start that long courtship process. Honestly, it might be better to proceed this way." Count Paris agreed and said he would go. We now cut to another scene in the play. A son of the Montague family, a young man named Romeo, is walking around depressed, talking to his 2 friends. He is depressed because he was just rejected by a woman to whom he confessed his love. Her name is Rosalind, and Romeo loves Rosalind more than life itself. He just met her before this scene and told her all his feelings. But Rosalind just doesn't feel the same about Romeo. The timing is terrible, but while you were saying those words, I was thinking, I should vow chastity soon. Sorry, Romeo, but this can't happen. Disappointed Romeo, his friends try to cheer him up, and then they think of an idea. Romeo should go to that party hosted by the Capulets tonight. After all, they say there will be tons of single women there. What better way to forget Rosalind than to compare her with other potential partners in real life? Romeo only wants to go because Rosalind will be there. At least he can look at her for a few minutes. Nevertheless, he agrees to go. So he shows up at this party. From the moment he arrives, he knows he has to be a little sneaky because he is in the Capulets' house. I mean, if anyone hears word that there is a Montague at this party, he will be in trouble. He looks around, scanning the room for signs of Rosalind, and then from the corner of his eye, he sees someone else. Although he doesn't know who she is, he knows she is the most beautiful person he has ever seen in his life. He says, "It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, a beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear." It turns out she likes him a little too. To call what happens between Romeo and Juliet love at first sight hardly describes the important things in it. I mean, these 2 kissed before they even knew each other's names. They immediately started talking to each other in their own verses, as if they had been together for many years. 10 minutes later, the degree of love between these 2 reached the limit that 2 people could reach. Of course, Juliet at this time didn't know Romeo was a Montague. And Romeo had completely forgotten about Rosalind. Who is Rosalind? After the party, both talked to a nurse close to Juliet in the Capulet family about each other. At this moment, they both realized that they had just fallen in love with the person who was supposed to be their mortal enemy. Is it right to fall in love with someone whose family beliefs are contrary to yours in all aspects? And, regardless of how they feel, is it even realistic to hope they can be together? These questions obviously flashed through their minds, but neither could ignore the experience at the party that night. After the party, Romeo couldn't stop thinking about Juliet, lurking in the bushes outside her balcony, overhearing her talking to herself about how much she loved him. He came out of the bushes to call her, and what followed was the famous balcony scene in the play, where they confessed their love to each other and agreed to get married the next day. Of course, their families couldn't know anything about this. So Romeo went to a local friar named Lawrence and asked him if he would be willing to marry them secretly. He agreed, and then he officiated the wedding for them. Now Romeo and Juliet have to deal with the consequences of how their love for each other will affect everything else in their lives. Pausing again for a moment, I can imagine Shakespeare writing this play knowing that Romeo and Juliet's behavior would trigger some pretty intense discussions among people. Because depending on who you are, you can view all this happening in the story in many different ways. Let's talk about a few of them. One obvious valid point, we should start here, Shakespeare would certainly appreciate it, is that Romeo and Juliet are clearly wrong here. Ultimately, these are just a pair of stupid teenagers who have no idea what love is, let alone what getting married means. They completely have no idea to what extent what they just did completely disrespects everything that made their love possible. Many people in the play will tell these two that they should think carefully again about what they are doing here, considering what impact this will have on things. And no matter who gives the advice, parents, friends, or the church, they ignore this advice again and again. In other words, from a certain perspective, for this intense feeling, this feeling they generated from being together for about 24 hours, they are going to burn every social institution and relationship that makes their lives possible to the ground. Their meeting at that party was only possible because of the sacrifices of many people around them. The lovely romantic iambic pentameter they poured out to each other comes from their shared culture that existed before them, a culture that makes anything they say to each other meaningful. Look, there are many people who will read this play as a cautionary tale about morality given by Shakespeare. It doesn't matter what Romeo and Juliet felt at a certain moment, everything they do in this play is spoiled and irresponsible. Acting based on having a certain intense feeling, really wanting something, and blatantly violating your responsibilities and everyone in the world who relies on you. Whether you do this to a person or for any other form of vice, you are wrong. Just because this is about your romantic life doesn't give you a get-out-of-jail-free card. You know, people from this camp might say that most people who have lived on this planet did not marry based on some romantic connection to others. Most people married for social mobility, consolidating alliances, and inheritance within the family. In the eyes of people in this camp, it is good if there is romantic love in marriage, but to base marriage on this intense feeling for someone like Romeo and Juliet did here is extremely irresponsible. Precisely because of how suddenly these feelings come, they can go just as suddenly. This kind of person would look at the divorce rates in societies that take a more romantic route, and they wouldn't be surprised at all. Now you can imagine walking out of the theater, having just watched this play, you can imagine this is one of the views someone might hold. But obviously, Shakespeare also wants people to consider another view of all this. This leans more towards Romeo and Juliet's side. There is a famous article about this play, published in 1961 by a man named Paul Ziegel. Specifically, he has a view on the way love is portrayed in the play, which has become very famous in conversations about it. In short, a point in his article is that what Shakespeare ultimately does in this play is to express a view of love that opposes the traditional Christian view of love. As characters, Romeo and Juliet represent a quasi-cult religion of love. By the time this play was released, this religion of love had been referenced in artworks throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. People give many examples as evidence where you can see this emerging religion of love. You see poets talking about love in the extremely passionate way Romeo and Juliet do in the play, sounding like this feeling of love is something that captures them. You have love imagery and myths used over the years, such as Cupid and Venus, both referenced in passing in the play. You even have a soteriology in this religion of love that rivals Christianity. Soteriology is the view on what allows people to achieve salvation. And in this religion of love around that era, dying in the name of your romantic love for another is the highest good achievable. Some even believe that if you die for the person you love, you will live with them in some lover's paradise after death. This became a kind of sainthood. In other words, people tried to live it out as members of this religion of love. Anyway, Ziegel believes that Shakespeare obviously knew all this stuff, and all these traces appear in Romeo and Juliet. Some appear directly in their language, which you can read. Some are just implied through the way the play handles their deaths. The point is, he says this is indeed what Shakespeare was thinking when creating these characters. He uses a tragedy to present the tension between the Christian view of love, marriage, and salvation, and the alternative views found in this religion of love. If this is an accurate description of Shakespeare's intent, then one direction you can take this conversation is to ask, what made the two specific characters, Romeo and Juliet, choose this religion of love instead of the ubiquitous Christian view around them? One answer to this might be that when people don't feel the world around them takes their existence very seriously, they're usually more likely to idealize romance and love for others like this. Think about how Juliet is sometimes merely a pawn in the marriage plot between her father and someone she doesn't even know. What she wants doesn't even matter that much to them. Think about how the feud between the two families, which neither Romeo nor Juliet actually cares much about, dominates every aspect of their lives in ways beyond their control. Think about how these two teenagers are mainly seen as extensions of their parents. I mean, remember the other point we just talked about? Who says teenagers know what love is? This point is usually considered a good point by people. Any feelings young people like this might have are not mature enough to be considered fully legitimate experiences. But a point Shakespeare raises is, when we deny people's experiences like this for some reason, if the world they live in doesn't even seem to recognize the legitimacy of the experiences they have, then romantic love like this, someone having an undeniable obsession with another person, which might feel to someone like the truest thing that has ever existed for them. Think about how this might apply to people living in a world today where many are struggling with meaning. Someone might look at the world they live in, where they are told they are a very important part of everything happening, but the actual world they see is one that doesn't seem to really care about them. Corruption is everywhere, alienated from everyone. I mean, in a setting where a person's entire existence feels like a postscript to the world, romantic love like this might feel like a near-religious experience for that person. Who is qualified to tell that person, or Romeo and Juliet, that what they feel is not real? So yes, this might seem to them like a very naive move, blatantly violating everything that makes up their lives. But from another perspective, what are they really burning down there? A group of people who don't really consider or care about them anyway. A group of people immersed in their own pride, honor duels, marriage conspiracies, and their whole set of religious nonsense. Maybe another way to look at Romeo and Juliet is that they are not irresponsible teenagers. They're just people who have the courage to act on what feels most true to them. This is what any brave person would do. If anything, their real crime here is just becoming people who are not cowards. This is usually also another point about how Shakespeare portrays love in this play. You know, this play has been out for hundreds of years, and generations from many different cultural backgrounds have seen it. Interestingly, people usually don't leave the theater after watching this play thinking the conclusion is that these two kids are two idiots. No, this is usually considered by people as one of the best love stories ever written. You have to ask, why is that? My point is that Romeo and Juliet embody something important about what love is in their teenage romance, something we cherish even outside of teenage romance. They say this is easy to miss in this play because most theories of love in philosophy talk about love as if it is either rational or irrational. Meaning, love is talked about as something we do for rational reasons. I love someone because I thought a lot, and they meet certain criteria of mine. But there is also a view that considers it irrational, that is, it falls completely outside the boundaries of rational and irrational. For example, what about a song? If someone asks you, is the song Happy Birthday to You rational or irrational in your opinion? In a sense, by asking this question, you are making a category error. A song is just not the kind of thing that is irrational or rational. So, what exactly are we talking about? Well, the same is true for love in some theories. But the point they make here is that the reason the audience usually sees Romeo and Juliet as a great love story is that love is neither purely rational nor purely irrational. When love is real, there are parts that are irrational that we feel when witnessing their relationship. Think about the two when they first met at the party. As an audience, we mainly notice three irrational things there. One, who they choose to love is irrational, and it is instantaneous, basically love at first sight. They didn't conduct a real vetting. Two, the depth of their falling in love is irrational. That level is, they went all in for each other at once. Three, the centrality of that love in their lives is irrational. The two are really willing to die for each other's love, and again, they have only known each other for a few days. This is not to say that we should imitate the behavior of these two crazy teenagers. If unrealistic, your life could fall into a very chaotic situation. It feels like a love story because, for example, that 50-year-old married couple who have been together for 30 years go to the theater to watch this play, and feel that this is a great love story, because love that lasts for 30 years like that undoubtedly must contain moments of this irrational form to survive. The love we admire most has this irrational element for some reason sometimes. And this is something about how we view love that seems to transcend culture or time. Anyway, a lot happened after Romeo and Juliet got married. Once Romeo returned to town, Juliet's cousin Tybalt challenged him to a duel because Romeo dared to come to their family party. Again, Tybalt killed Romeo's friend, and Romeo killed Tybalt. Do you remember the prince said what would happen if these families fought again? Well, surprise, he didn't actually execute the punishment he said. He just exiled Romeo and said he could never come back. Shortly after this, Juliet's family pulled her aside and said she was going to marry Count Paris, and she had no say in this anymore. She went to Friar Lawrence for help. What can I do to stop all this from happening? What can I do to be with Romeo? At this moment, the friar came up with perhaps one of the worst plans ever conceived by the human mind. Friar Lawrence gives Juliet a sleeping potion, and the whole plan is that this will make her look dead. Then once her family has mourned her departure and completed the entire funeral process, she will wake up from this sleep, slip out of the graveyard, and then go to the neighboring city to live with Romeo. This is really the plan. The friar also has to send a letter to Romeo telling him the whole plan, and it turns out this letter never actually reached him. So when Romeo heard rumors that Juliet was now dead, when he came back and saw Juliet seemingly dead in her family's tomb, well, he stabbed Count Paris to death. Paris saw Romeo there, thinking he was there to desecrate the tomb of a rival family member. He didn't know they were married. After Romeo killed him, he drank a bottle of poison, lay beside Juliet, and died. Then Juliet, who woke up just a few minutes later, saw Romeo lying beside her, and having done this, she decided to end her own life too, so she could be with Romeo forever. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about this Friar Lawrence as a character over the years. It is said that Shakespeare implanted a critique of Stoicism in his character, an alternative Stoicism, for what it's worth. Sometimes people say his character is really there to show what happens when people overestimate their expertise trying to help others, only to cause more harm. Anyway, these families finally came together after the children died. The play ends with the town of Verona finally expecting a brief period of peace between the families. Next, we are talking about Shakespeare's play Hamlet. This is the third Shakespeare work we have talked about in this episode. This time I want to do something more heuristic. Usually, we discuss the events in the play and give analyses from those who have dedicated their lives to Shakespeare studies, both of which will certainly appear in this episode. But the slightly different thing I want to do today is to inspire you to read classic literature like this in a slightly different way. I want to talk about reading this play like a philosopher. If part of the philosopher's work is to take concepts that seem very familiar to us, like love or justice, if part of what they do is to delve deep into them, show us a brand new side of things, and help us see the world in a new way, then Hamlet is a very familiar play in classic literature, right? So, what if a philosopher re-examines the entire play, also giving us an exciting new perspective, injecting life into the work and making it more relevant? Building on the views of
Nietzsche,
Hegel, Benjamin, and others on Hamlet as a play, philosopher Simon Critchley and psychoanalyst Jameson Webster will team up to interpret Hamlet through a more modern, tragic, and philosophical lens than you usually hear. Although they do not oppose traditional interpretations of this play, they call it a kind of biscuit box Shakespeare. This is a term they used in an interview, meaning it is a bit generic, right? Like that interpretation of Hamlet everyone knows. There is nothing evil about it. But they do think Shakespeare should stir something in people's hearts. The interpretation of this play they elaborated in the book titled Stay Illusion. The Hamlet doctrine will do just that at the end of today's episode. Anyway, there's a lot of content. Let's jump straight into the events of the play. The play begins on the front wall of a castle in Denmark. The castle guards stationed at the night watchtower have seen something that scares them a bit over the past few nights. A ghost has been visiting them on the front platform of the castle. When it appears, it just walks up to them, stares at their faces, and when they try to go up and talk to it, it turns and walks away. So on this specific night when the play begins, the guards are better prepared this time. They brought a man named Horatio, who is a scholar and a friend of the royal family. Their plan is to let him look at this ghost when it appears, hoping he might know what is the right thing to do next. Sure enough, standing on this platform that night, the ghost appeared again. When Horatio saw it, he noticed something they had warned him about. The ghost's face looked exactly like the recently deceased former king. The guards and Horatio decided that the best course of action might be to tell the son of the person they think the ghost looks like, the young prince of the castle, Prince Hamlet. When his friend Horatio approaches Hamlet to tell him what happened, we see a character in Hamlet who is clearly a person in considerable pain. I mean, this makes sense. He just lost his father. But not only that, he recently discovered that his mother, the queen, decided to marry another man named Claudius, the former king's brother, so soon after his father's death. Most importantly, he recently felt something was wrong with the entire royal family he was in. This is usually where he thinks he is a quite important figure. Not so much recently. So when his friend tells him that his dead father's ghost just appeared in front of the castle, when the same ghost appears in front of Hamlet later that night, Hamlet is not exactly in the mood to receive more bad news. But he gets some anyway. His father's ghost tells him that he didn't die casually that day, but was murdered by the man his mother just chose to marry, Claudius. The implication of all this for Hamlet is, of course, that he must do something. The entire court he is in is now rotten and corrupt. Society would tell him that if you want to be an honorable son in this situation, the right thing to do here is to kill this Claudius and avenge your father's death. Even before all these terrible things happened to him, Hamlet was already a person who might think a bit too much about things. But now he gets this news, and now his head turns into a veritable snow globe. He struggles painfully with what is the right thing to do in this situation. After all, sitting by and doing nothing is not an option. But at the same time, listen, just because society says I should go out and kill this person doesn't mean that's the right thing. By the way, how do I know if this Claudius is really guilty? Who did I hear it from? Not exactly the most reliable source, a damn ghost told me. How do I know it's telling the truth? How do I know the ghost is real? Could it not be some evil demon deceiving me? So he comes up with a plan. He's going to feign madness to buy himself some time, while observing Claudius, trying to figure out what to do next. But as time goes on, the more he ruminates, the more people around him see this strange behavior. Eventually, he starts to think he is a coward. Eventually, he even starts to loathe himself because he is a person who cannot make a decision. Hamlet is gradually consumed by this unresolved internal torture. Here is already a good place to pause and start discussing some of the philosophy behind this. I will start with more traditional interpretations and then talk about Webster and Critchley's interpretation. A common interpretation of the current story events is that Shakespeare was writing during the Renaissance. This means he was in the period after the Middle Ages and before the Enlightenment. Importantly, this makes him a person who would be painfully aware in his time that he was living in the aftermath of a clash of ideas. In this clash, Renaissance humanism was produced. Under this interpretation, Hamlet as a character, in all his moral confusion, in his lack of ability to choose and decide, many critics would say this is Shakespeare staging a tension. The tension that occurs when early forms of moral guidance rooted in things like God from the Middle Ages collide with later Renaissance humanism. In the latter, these answers are not so easily available to people, thus creating those who are always trapped in battles within their own minds. Hamlet's snow globe brain is what happens when we as humans try to figure out moral answers completely on our own. This view holds that in this play, he's indeed trying very hard to figure out what the right thing is, and he is indeed very afraid of making the wrong decision. Under this interpretation, Hamlet is a good man in a bad situation. This view holds that Shakespeare wrote this play as a severely underrated moral psychologist, long before psychology became a field or profession. This view holds that ultimately the character of Hamlet is a brilliant work, because whoever you are, reading it in the modern world, we can all see a bit of ourselves in Prince Hamlet. Perhaps this whole point is best seen in the famous speech he delivers later in the play, where he says, "To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them." You know, under this interpretation, his entire speech can be seen as some ultimate representation of this emerging modern way of thinking. Even when it comes to the seemingly simple question of whether to continue our lives, our destiny in this new modern identity and thought tendency is to always question and second-guess ourselves, never fully knowing what the right thing is. However, there is also the possibility here to interpret Hamlet as a character who is not like this at all. What if we read Hamlet more like philosophers? Friedrich Nietzsche believed that completely different conclusions could be drawn from the character of Hamlet. He wrote in The Birth of Tragedy, "Knowledge kills action. Action requires the veils of illusion. That is the doctrine of Hamlet." What if Hamlet is not just a good man unable to act because he cannot decide what the right thing is? What if Hamlet is instead interpreted as a man unable to act because he sees through the whole game, namely, rationalizing our own behavior after the fact, and then calling it morality to make ourselves feel better? As Nietzsche said, action requires the veils of illusion. Hamlet is a man unable to act because he lacks the moral illusion to justify what he wants to do. For example, when he discovers his father was murdered, he doesn't have to be confused. He could listen to society, do the honorable thing, and kill Claudius directly. That is a ready-made answer, right in front of him. Theoretically doing so is completely justified morally. But under this interpretation, he sees through that option as merely a story. The whole idea that he can just kill a person and then his hands are morally clean simply because he has a good reason for doing it, he knows too much to ever convince himself of something so simple about our behavior. He knows killing here risks accidentally killing innocent people. He knows his actions might have consequences. It might trigger a very chaotic war of succession regarding who will rule next. He knows this might drag all sorts of other innocent people into this matter, not just the Danish people. In other words, knowledge here kills action. And action requires the veils of illusion. For Nietzsche, Hamlet is just a person who sees through this moral game played when we face every possible choice. What many people actually do is just act, then come up with a good moral reason to explain why they had to do that thing, and then sit there bathing in some illusion, thinking they are absolved of any real complexity and consequences of what they have done. Hamlet cannot make that decision because he cannot bring himself to live in such an illusion. This is how Critchley and Webster describe the character of Hamlet as somewhat anti-Oedipus. Remember Oedipus we talked about in the episode on Greek tragedy? A brief review. In that story, Oedipus is a king who killed a random stranger, then married a widowed queen, and had children with her. He cursed the murderer of the old king. He launched a full investigation into the case, only to realize in the end that he was actually the person he had been hunting. He was the one who killed the former king. Their point is that Oedipus is a person who acted in complete ignorance. Webster and Critchley believe that Hamlet is anti-Oedipus. He is a person whose knowledge of his own father's death and his insight into the moral games most people play caused him to be unable to take action from the very beginning. This is also exactly what they refer to in the book title The Hamlet Doctrine. This is the name they give to this idea, that knowledge and insight have the ability in practice to kill people's action in the world. Hamlet is not a good man in a bad situation. Hamlet is a man stuck in an unsustainable internal situation. Because even if he is suspicious of what actually happened to his father, he is completely unable to do the normal thing, which is to accept what happened, integrate it into his life, and try to move on. But at the same time, he is also unable to take action to do anything that might be redemptive, pushing things forward, because he sees through the illusion and knows that anything he does is just rationalizing his behavior after the fact. So what we see in Hamlet is a person best described as paralyzed. All this excess psychic energy that cannot be metabolized is transformed into the shame, self-loathing, and melancholy about his situation that we see through his behavior in the play. Like victims of other traumatic events often do, Hamlet begins to lash out at everyone around him, his lover Ophelia, his friends, and colleagues at court. Again, Hamlet is not just a guy who can't make a decision. Another way to interpret this whole thing is that Hamlet is a damaged, often mean, unlikable, unchangeable person. Thus he becomes complicit in everything that starts to happen in the subsequent story. First, because once Hamlet adopted this strategy of feigning madness and attacking everyone around him, the guy named Claudius started to get a little suspicious of him. He asked, as the new ruler of this whole place, how should I really use the resources I have to find out what exactly is wrong with this guy Hamlet? He came up with a plan. He was going to find Hamlet's two old friends and let them hang out with him, trying to get information about what made him suddenly act so crazy. Their names in the play are Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Sounds like a law firm or something. Anyway, they got some information by spying on him like this. Claudius and his inner circle developed a theory that the reason for Hamlet's erratic behavior recently must be related to his love for a woman named Ophelia. Everyone knew there was something between her and Hamlet. So they came up with another plan. Let's arrange a meeting, using Ophelia as a kind of bait. She can talk to Hamlet, and we can eavesdrop to see if our theory is really what is happening, or if we are just all imagining it. The meeting takes place in a huge hall of the castle. Ophelia sits in the hall, reading a prayer book, which is her standard behavior. Hamlet enters the room, and it is at this moment in the play that he delivers the famous to be or not to be speech we discussed. After he finishes speaking, Ophelia tries to talk to him. But this is exactly the moment he decides to lash out at her. He insults her. He tells her she needs to get to a nunnery as soon as possible. You know, just implying some very terrible things about her. She is hurt. Hamlet is yelling at someone again. Claudius, who used Ophelia for spying just now, realizes that whatever Hamlet is angry about really has nothing to do with his interest in Ophelia. So when he lets his chief spy go hide in the closet to be able to eavesdrop on another conversation of Hamlet, and when Hamlet notices someone is in the closet and finally stabs the person to death, Claudius realizes more than ever that now might be a good time to get rid of this guy named Hamlet before he becomes a bigger problem for himself. Now let's pause again, because all this spying scene in the play so far can be interpreted in several different important ways. More traditional interpretations usually see all the spying Shakespeare added here as a reflection of Elizabethan English society when Shakespeare created this work. Historians sometimes refer to the entire 16th century England as the birthplace of the modern surveillance state we know now. Shakespeare lived in a world where spy networks were emerging at a whole new level. The government was embedding double agents. There was code breaking. If they didn't like what priests said to the public, they would torture and throw priests into prison. They would intercept letters and read them before delivery. I mean, Shakespeare himself actually even had to get approval from the censor's office in his writing. If the work didn't fit a certain narrative, that office requested him to change content in his works multiple times. So, the more traditional interpretation of the spying by Claudius and his inner circle in the play is that this is a reflection of what was happening in Shakespeare's real world. What does the world start to look like when we make surveillance like this commonplace in the way people do business with each other? But Critchley and Webster's interpretation reinforces this whole interpretation into something completely different. They say, Hamlet's world is a globe defined by ubiquitous espionage, of which his self-monitoring is but one simulation. Hamlet is the drama of surveillance in a police state, so to speak. Look again. What if we read Hamlet like philosophers? What if we interpret the surveillance in the play as something beyond people just spying on each other in closets? What if surveillance is actually a structural condition of the play, a key to being able to understand how everything in it happens? Let's try to argue for this. I mean, first, obviously, many main events in the play indeed revolve around some kind of ongoing espionage. This is indeed true. But Critchley and Webster say even more than that. Hamlet's entire internal experience, you know, his constant self-analysis, constant looking inward as his primary interface with the world. What if this is a tendency of his, a tendency generated by the way his entire external world is structured? When the environment a person lives in monitors and tracks you in a certain way, giving you no free space to be, it makes sense to constantly monitor oneself. I mean, even just in the sense of self-protection, why not relentlessly track my own inner experience so that I can ensure I won't face problems when tracked by others? If this is true, then a question we can ask when reading Hamlet is, what if external surveillance like this produces a kind of narcissism in people? Given the world we live in now is often called a digital panopticon that no one can truly escape, all the different forms of tracking and surveillance we are immersed in every day, how do these affect people's behavior in ways that are not obvious to us? This way usually manifests only as personality quirks in polite conversation. If you interpret Hamlet this way, if the world continues to move in this direction of more and more surveillance, honestly there might be a day, if the authorities realize this message in the play, Hamlet might change from a play students often read in school to something students are banned from reading, for fear they will start thinking about how they are living in some kind of police state similar to Claudius's tactics. But that being said, what follows is arguably the most important scene in the whole play, and it involves Ophelia. If you remember the previous plot, she is the woman Hamlet yelled at and said she needed to send herself to a nunnery. In a previous scene, when Hamlet was being spied on, the ending was Hamlet stabbing a person hiding behind the curtain in the closet. Well, to clarify, the person Hamlet stabbed there was named Polonius. Polonius was not only the head of Claudius's spy network, but he also happened to be Ophelia's father. This moment marks a quite significant turning point in the meaning of everything happening in the story. Because although Hamlet was just feigning madness before as a tactic, the current Ophelia, considering the huge price she has paid so far, she is actually a person starting to lose her mind. Think about what she went through. She was used by the royal family as part of their grand plan to save themselves and spy on Hamlet. Then in the process of being forced to participate, she was treated cruelly and rejected by Hamlet, whom she cared about very much. Then her father hid behind the curtain of the closet and was killed by the guy who just said a lot of nasty things about her. So we then cut to a scene of Ophelia in the play. She appears, obviously having major mental health issues, which is not shocking. She speaks to people in these strange fragments and riddles. Sometimes she talks to herself. She is singing, but only weird parts of songs. She even starts distributing these flowers to people, and when she does this, distributing flowers obviously has some symbolic meaning, evidently everyone around should know. But no one cares. In other words, she is in a bad spot. Fast forward to just a few scenes later, Hamlet's mother rushes into the scene, informing everyone that Ophelia has just been found floating dead in the river, surrounded by flowers. She apparently fell from a willow tree by the river. Whether this was accidental or intentional was never explicitly stated by anyone. But you know, this is another tragedy, and many readers treat her death as if it were intentional. Many people say that the character of Ophelia is actually the tragic hero of this play, even though Hamlet is in the title and is the protagonist. A more traditional interpretation of Ophelia sees her character as a figure Shakespeare wanted to include in this play to symbolize a kind of lost innocence. This is the tragic price that must be paid when people in society and families are too obsessed with their own ego-driven corrupt nonsense. This is very much like the royal family in the play. This interpretation would say, if Hamlet is a person who lost his father and eventually found himself collapsing in a very internal way, then Ophelia can be interpreted as a person who lost her father and acts as some kind of foil to Hamlet. For Shakespeare, this is another way a person can collapse externally. All this is because we allow political or moral corruption to spread unchecked. This interpretation itself is perfectly fine. Of course, this is also another way we can view the character of Ophelia. Honestly, just on the character of Ophelia and how different philosophers have interpreted her over the years, we could do a whole episode. But because we are talking about Critchley and Webster today, they would ask, what if Ophelia is actually where we see the classic ambiguity that creates this tragedy? What if she is the real tragic hero of this play? Think about her character, they might say. She is the person in the play who loves Hamlet. She is used by everyone around her, her father, brother, other members of the royal family. Through the events in the play, as a person involved in all this around her, she is pushed to the limit. Then in her only true language of exchange, which is the only thing left for her to express her stance after everything else has been stripped away, she ends her life. In other words, it is useful to first view Ophelia as a character very similar to Antigone in early Greek tragedy. Antigone is the story of a woman whose king refused to give her brother a proper burial. The king said she couldn't bury him, that was a traitor, His body must be displayed as a message to everyone else, don't be a traitor. Antigone refused to comply with this. She said she had a duty to her brother and the gods, which was much more important than anything the king had to say. So she went out and buried him anyway. After doing this, the king locked her in a cave and left her to die. And in the cave, instead of waiting to call for help, waiting for someone to save her life, she decided to end her life while trapped in the cave, as one of the few true acts of solidarity she had left. Again, let's compare Antigone and Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Think about the similarities. Ophelia also has something she strongly desires and tries as hard as possible to give it to someone. She is also treated completely like an object by the king, not to mention all the other men around. I mean, for all these guys coordinating things, she essentially became a tool for the whim of the day. And when she met the end of the world she found herself trapped in, she ended her life in a way she saw as the final act of expression. The point is, as a member of this royal family who completely treated her as a pawn in their own rationalization and calculation of everything, her death is considered an act of love. Her madness and her death become a kind of heroic truth in the play, because they expose what this world is trying so hard to reduce her to, nothing. In fact, this is one of several reasons why in their interpretation of this play, they say Hamlet is ultimately a story about nothing. Not a story about a prince named Hamlet having to make difficult decisions. No, in a very significant sense, they say this is a play about nothingness. Nothingness in the form of nihilism. Hamlet is reduced to nothing because he is trapped in a state of paralysis, unable to accept nor move forward. Ophelia is reduced to nothing by the men and conspiracies around using her. Even most actors in the play are reduced to nothing, because almost every main character except Horatio dies in the end. This is where understanding the important difference between Hamlet and Ophelia lies, if you want to consider how Critchley and Webster view the deepest parts of their characters. Ultimately, what makes Ophelia so different from Hamlet is that Ophelia is a person who actually has the capacity to love. A famous quote from Dostoevsky about love is cited here. We talked about this quote when doing the show about him. He said, "Hell is the inability to love." This sentence is almost the core of Hamlet's entire existence on this planet. They say the first thing to understand here is that love is always something based on some kind of lack. They base this point on Lacan's view. Whenever we want to be loved by another person, we love because we have a need or because we are incomplete. More importantly, truly loving others always requires a vulnerability, and Hamlet as a character simply does not allow this vulnerability to enter his life. Every time love approaches Hamlet in the play, he has to escape into his mind, escape into some kind of commentary, which involves humor, social performance, and he sometimes even uses cruelty. He does all this just to not have to show others any form of need he might have. Just because you are afraid of what it means for you if you don't have answers, spending your life endlessly thinking in your own head, needing a rational explanation for everything. There is a word to describe that life: hell. Hell is the inability to love. And Hamlet as a character in the play is almost the epitome of this. He must control everything, but can do nothing. Notice how Ophelia is the opposite of all this in many important ways. She did find ways to act and do things in the world, but she often had almost no control over what she could actually do. She represents the person Hamlet never found a way to become, a person truly capable of being vulnerable and loving, a person whose final act becomes a protest against the broken way of life that has become so normalized for others in the castle. Anyway, tying up the rest of the story. If you are a fan of death, then the rest of this play will be a real treat for you. As I mentioned before, Claudius wanted Hamlet dead after discovering that thing was about him. So he sent him on a ship to England with his two friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. But he sent them with a letter to England. Hamlet opened the letter on the way and saw the letter was telling the recipient to kill him. So he modified the letter to kill his two friends. He gave the letter to them to deliver, and eventually returned to the castle. Once he returned, he was challenged to a fencing match by Ophelia's brother. Hamlet and her brother were eventually both stabbed by a sword dipped in poison. Before he died, Hamlet forced the king to drink the poisoned wine he had prepared for Hamlet. Basically, if you hear about a person in the play not named Horatio, by the end of the play they always find some way to die. Anyway, if I were to leave you with one last point from Webster and Critchley outside of all this, it is a general point about knowledge itself in the play. By the way, maybe you have noticed by now that in today's episode about William Shakespeare, every play involves some significant trap we might experience when it comes to knowledge, right? In Julius Caesar, you could say it is about how easily we are susceptible to the power of rhetoric when choosing our knowledge of the world. In Romeo and Juliet, you could say it is about how imprisoned we find ourselves if we just accept any inherited ideology given to us. Well, now in Hamlet, you could say it is about the real risk we face when we overanalyze our knowledge, and if not careful, how it kills the action we desperately need in the world. But regardless, even beyond all these, there is a side point about knowledge worth mentioning, embodied by the character of Hamlet. I just feel this episode would be incomplete without at least mentioning this. Something worth thinking about. It goes like this. The character of Hamlet shows us that sometimes the knowledge we need most is precisely the knowledge that destroys us most on an existential level and on an identity level. This is certainly true for Hamlet in the play. When he received knowledge about his father from the ghost, it destroyed him. I think this is also a true point for most of us. Although when someone needs it, being the person giving this knowledge is tough. I am Raymond Shadow. Thank you everyone for listening, and hope you like and subscribe to me. See you next time.